Dirty Politics, Hard Times, a trilogy of Chartism, Book 3, Daniel Aykroyd's Revenge. Chapter 9. The spring of 1856, and young Daniel Aykroyd was enjoying life. His apprenticeship was proceeding well, and old William Mather gave him responsibilities with which not many apprentices of his age would be trusted. This only served to boost the lad's confidence, and, in turn, it boosted his enthusiasm for work and increased his determination to learn as much as he could. He enjoyed the simple act of walking to the factory each morning, whatever the weather might throw at him, anticipating something new each day. His studies at the Mechanics' Institute were going well, and he'd come to the notice of some of its most notable backers. He'd been present at lectures given by Joseph Whitworth, one of the outstanding and pioneering engineers of his day, and by Robert Angus Smith, who in 1841 had taken up work as an analytical chemist at the Royal Manchester Institution. Here the Scot had researched the environmental problems resulting from the manufacturing system, and in particular the health problems, damage to buildings, flora and fauna, the burning of coal created. He was the first to show how the atmosphere in Manchester and Salford, so contaminated by sulphur from the burning of fossilised fuel and the resultant smoke, produced acid rain. Despite its name, the Mechanics' Institute had many notable founders and supporters, including Colin and William Mather and Whitworth, one of whom was John Dalton, the father of atomic theory and science, whose lectures Daniel had also attended. Irene Rose had also introduced Daniel to people in the artistic and literary world, including Elizabeth Gaskell, who lived on Plymouth Grove in Chorlton-upon-Medlock. The wife of a Unitarian minister and an established author with a real feel for and genuine interest in the labouring poor, she'd given him a bound copy of her novel Mary Barton, which he would treasure all his life, as would his children and their children. Thus life for Daniel was full and busy, although all his waking hours weren't devoted to work or study. He delighted in the companionship of his beloved Connie, who, having made her mind up that her future lay with him, had lost most of her airs and graces. She'd recognised their future together must inevitably mean striving along with other members of the working class, from which fate had once rescued her, although fate had taken the cruellest form it could, and in doing so had deprived Benjamin, Faith and herself of their birth parents. Nonetheless, Connie quite rightly felt she still had standards to maintain, and unlike young Bess, who was of course middle class by birth, she didn't intend to learn Lancashire dialect. As long as people speaking the dialect could understand her, and she could more or less understand them, was all that mattered as far as the lass was concerned. However, people did tend to remark to Irene Rose that Constance's Manchester accent seemed more pronounced of late. Irene Rose knew such comments were often meant to be disparaging, but, being the kind of woman she was, naturally took great pleasure in such observations. The two youngsters' love had developed and matured, and everybody who knew them took it for granted they'd marry sooner or later. They particularly enjoyed the theatre and dancing, at which both were now proficient. They occasionally attended the newly opened ballroom at Bellevue Zoological Gardens. They regularly attended the socials and musical evenings, which had become a regular feature at Mary's Kitchen. Additionally, when they could escape from the town, they both loved tramping in and exploring open upland countryside, a Sunday pastime made possible for many ordinary people by the growth and expansion of the railways. From the railway station at Hardwick, they had a choice of destinations: trains to Saddleworth and the West Riding of Yorkshire, to the Dark Peak via Glossop, to the White Peak via Buxton, or to Cheshire via Rosehill Station, Marple, travelled from there. Nathaniel West's disappearance was soon forgotten. Within 2 weeks, William Mather had other customers for the 2 printing machines built for West, and the issue, which had rankled with him so much at the time, has seemingly been confined to the dustbin of history. Daniel was extremely surprised, therefore, one Friday afternoon in May, when calling to William's office to be asked if he could visit the Beehive Mill once more. "Yes, sir, but does it have to be this evening?" "Why, is there a problem, Daniel? It's Connie's birthday and there's a session of Irish music at Mary's kitchen. She loves Irish music. Her father's playing and I promised I'd take her." "Meeting's at 7, lad. You've plenty of time to meet her afterwards, surely." It sounded like a statement, not a question. "Come on, lad. You'll be doing me a great favour, and ours that important, tha knows." "Yes, you're right, Mr. Mother. But can I go early to warn Connie? She finishes work at 6. William looked at the grandmother clock in the corner of his office. "Aye, lad. Get this helm off. It's almost 4. The lad grinned, thanked him, and began to make his way out of the office. "There's just one thing, our Daniel." He turned back. William held out a file of documents. "They'll be needing this, I reckon. Pin 'em down to a firm delivery date this time. There's a good lad." Daniel nodded agreement. With that, William turned his attention back to his pile of correspondence. Daniel made his way back to his workbench, taking his work apron off as he did so, a thoughtful look on his face. "Daniel, what are you doing here so early?" The lad grinned at Constance, who had a baby on her lap, changing a dirty thingamajig. "Do you mind making your own way here tonight, Connie? I have to work late." "I don't mind, but why do you have to work?" "It's just some unfinished business I have to deal with. Mr. Mather's relying on me." "Mr. William Mather has you wrapped around his little finger. I thought you were a revolutionary." She looked at him and pulled her face. "There's more ways to stuff a cat than strangling it." "What's strangling a cat got to do with stuffing it?" "I haven't a clue, Connie," he grinned. "Anyhow, once I've finished my apprenticeship, there'll be plenty of time to concentrate on politics." "All right, Daniel, I'll let you off this once, but would you like a cup of tea, Connie?" he asked, anticipating the end of her sentence. "Good evening, Mr. Ackroyd. You're early. I was going to suggest we meet in the Honeycomb." It had just gone 10 to 7. Daniel had arrived at the Beehive Mill with time in hand, determined to finish business as quickly as possible, not wishing to disappoint Constance. He found the main entrance of the mill unlocked and climbed up the stairs to the 3rd floor office. Its lights were on, so he'd knocked and walked straight in. Nathaniel West sat at his desk looking at him intently. Daniel placed the file of documents in front of West and then put his hand in his inside pocket and pulled out his weapon in its leather cover. This time he intended to use it. "Have you never wondered about my name, Mr. West?" he asked. Nathaniel looked up at him, taken by surprise. "Ackroyd's a common enough name in this part of the world. There's at least half a dozen work here," he said dismissively, returning his gaze to the documents. "My parents aren't common, though, Mr. West. My father's an outstanding craftsman in wood, and Matthew Etherall's building superintendent." "That's very interesting, Mr. Ackroyd." West looked at the clock mounted on the wall. It was fast approaching 7. "I think we should be leaving. We can do our business in the Honeycomb." Daniel had the idea he was agitated. He ignored him. "We have time yet, Mr. West," he responded, a cold edge to his voice. "Like my father, my mother was very special as well." He looked West in the eye. "She was a spinner at Gibraltar Mill, and a dedicated worker, a trade unionist and a chartist. Her name was Elizabeth, Bess for short." "Was? Is she no longer with us?" Daniel smiled a grim smile. "No, Bess Ackroyd's no longer alive. She was killed, as was her unborn baby. She was a couple of months pregnant at the time." "That's very sad. There are far too many industrial accidents. Hans should take more care, but we really must be going." West now seemed desperate to leave. "You're not going anywhere, Mr. West. You killed my mother and her unborn baby, and I'm going to kill you. A tooth for a tooth, and an eye for an eye, as the good book decrees." His hand went into his right-hand pocket, and he pulled out a wooden handle, shaped like that belonging to a dagger. He began to screw it onto the end of his scribe, taking care not to cross the thread, staring grimly into West's eyes all the time. The mill owner seemed to be in a state of shock. He stared back with the eyes of a petrified stoat, as though turned to stone. My mother knew in the last few seconds of her life she was going to die a painful, horrible death, and she knew her unborn baby was going to die, and she knew who her killer was. He came at her out of the blue, his face a mask of hate and fury, riding a white steed and brandishing a club, followed by 6 others, just like the horse riders of the apocalypse. The mill owner's eyes opened wide. Now he knew who Daniel Ackroyd really was. It was an accident, I tell you. Nobody was supposed to be hurt, he protested, his normally pale face turning a paler shade of grey. We must get out of here, we really must, he continued. You don't understand, we're going to... Daniel cut him off curtly. You set out that day to break a strike and break heads, he interjected. You trampled my mother down. You cantered over her on your white stallion and you killed her. It was an act of cold-blooded, callous murder, and you thought you got away with it. The magistrate was a mill owner like you, wasn't he? And like you, he had contempt for working people. To him, my mother was just another pair of hands, solely designed to operate a machine and easily replaced. She wouldn't be missed. It wasn't like that. No, it wasn't. My mother was sorely missed. She was missed by her fellow mill workers, by her friends and trade union colleagues. She was missed by the Manchester Chartists. Above all, my father missed her. He's never recovered, and still nurses a broken heart. Not least, she was missed by me. Thanks to you, I have no memory of her. I have to rely on others to tell me about her. He looked down at his adversary, seeing just an inhuman enemy for whom he held nothing but hatred and loathing, his anger building. There could be no turning back. Mr. West, you're going to learn what it's like to know you've only seconds to live. You're going to die in fear and torment, knowing that, unlike my mother, you're going to burn in hell. He raised the weapon high above his head and plunged it down towards West's head. Time stood still. He took in the look of shock, fear, and the hatred, the terrible, overwhelming, cold hatred in West's eyes. The man sat transfixed, his hands seemingly riveted to his desktop. He clearly realized he only had moments to live. Then he screamed a high-pitched scream. No! A complete waste of breath. The weapon, carefully tempered in the fire, descended with great speed and great force to fulfill its intended purpose. West's cry resonated through the office, echoed up the mill tower, and then a shocking silence reigned as he crumpled forwards across the desk. Daniel looked down, his hatred replaced by a feeling of deep contempt and a peculiar kind of pity. This highly privileged man, born a fellow human being, had simply been corrupted by greed, twisted by the very economic system through which he secured his privilege and wealth. The lad calmly retrieved his weapon, unscrewed the handle, and replaced the steel in its leather cover, feeling strangely fulfilled, as though a part of his life had come to an end and he was reborn and cleansed. He picked up the file of documents, made his way out of the office and down the stairs, in no particular hurry. As he reached the top of the last flight, a man burst out of the ground floor weaving shed of the mill, slamming the doors shut behind him, before plunging out of the main door into the yard. Daniel took the stairs 2 at a time and watched. The fellow ran out of the mill yard into the honeycomb pothouse. It was the overlooker, Jed Smith. Daniel wondered why he was there and why he'd fled the premises. Then he smelt the smoke. He turned to his left, about to open the doors into the ground floor section of the mill, when he heard the unmistakable crackling sounds. The weaving shed was on fire. Instinctively, he left the doors firmly closed. So, That was the reason Wes was so eager to leave. Daniel had automatically assumed it was because he'd put the fear of God into him, and Wes felt hemmed in. The lad turned away from the weaving shed doors, shaking his head at his own dreadful thoughts. "Daniel, where have you been? Oh my God, what have you been up to?" Constance looked aghast at the young man she loved so much. His hair singed, his face black, his clothes partly burnt. He looked a mess and he stank of smoke. His right hand was blooded, as was his forehead. He sat down wearily next to a shocked Irene Rose, and with no thought for her attire put an arm around her and placed his head on her shoulder. Instinctively, without thought, the mill owner's daughter put her own arm around him, as his mother would have done. "It's over and done with, Aunt Rose," he confessed. "I've avenged my mother's death. She can sleep easy." The mill owner's daughter looked at him, shocked and panicking, as did Constance. "What are you saying, Daniel? What do you mean?" "I've taken care of Nathaniel West," he responded. With that he stood up and staggered into Mary Upton's kitchen. Emma Chadwick was talking to Amy. She looked around, astonished at Daniel's sudden appearance, and not least by his appearance. By the time Irene Rose and Constance had gathered their wits and followed, Emma had removed his jacket and shirt and was briskly washing him at the stone sink, using a once clean thingamajig, before washing his begrimed hair. Amy busied herself heating more water in the copper and had the kettle on, ready to make her young friend some tea. Irene Rose sat down at the kitchen table, trying to work out how best to protect him, all kinds of ideas going through her mind. What time was the next train to London? Would there be a ship to Australia? Should she get him to the continent instead? Did Michael still have contacts in France? How much cash could she lay her hands on? How much would they need? They, should Constance go with him? Should she? Eventually, Emma was satisfied with her work. He had a cut above his left eye, but once she'd cleansed it, she realised it was only superficial. She assumed this was the source of the blood on his right hand, although the latter seemed to have had copious amounts over it. She dried his face, back and chest, and his arms. Daniel just let her get on with it. He felt comfortable with Emma, and always had. She ruffled his thick black hair as soon as she'd tried it. "Right," she said. "Sit this hell down, Daniel Ackroyd, and tell us just how you got yourself in this state." "There's been a fire at the Beehive Mill." He looked at Irene Rose and Constance. "Jed Smith set it, at Nathaniel West's behest. I think West wanted me there at 7 to provide an alibi. Unfortunately, I arrived early and bearded him in his office. He kept saying we must go to the Honeycomb. I think he meant to be waiting outside for me at 7. Then he'd pretend to lock the mill door, and we'd go for our discussion while Smith set fire to the place." "God, Daniel, please say you haven't killed him," Irene Rose exclaimed. "I can't help but remember what you said all those years ago." "Never in a month of Sundays," Emma responded, sharply rushing to the lad's defence. "Our Daniel couldn't hurt out an air whirl, I'm telling thee now." "You're wrong, Emma," he replied quietly. He suddenly looked bewildered, remembering what he'd done. Emma frowned in disbelief, denying the all too clear message delivered by her own ears. Constance seemed horrified, and Irene Rose struck dumb. "That's why I went early, and that's why I took this. I set out to kill him. It was premeditated." He passed his scribe over to Emma, knowing he had no use for it any more. He gazed into her questioning eyes, shaking his head, as if to say sorry for letting her down. "We've got to get you away from here as soon as possible," Irene Rose exclaimed. "They'll soon find his body, fire or no fire." Daniel shook his head again, this time to signify his disagreement. "They already have. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not running away." Constance felt her future happiness crumbling away. Emma glanced down at the weapon in her hand, something niggling at the back of her mind. "I don't believe it," she insisted once more. "There's no way you could kill anyone, Daniel Ackroyd, and that's a fact. You're hiding summat." Daniel laughed aloud, tension draining from him. "And I could do out wrong in thine eyes, could I, my lovely Em? You always trusted me far too much for your own good, if you think about it." He looked down at his right hand, now devoid of blood. He shrugged and locked onto the eyes of his lifelong friend again, only too aware how deeply he loved and cared for her, and knowing how much she loved and cared for him in return. He took her hand in his, caressing it. "He was such a snivelling little coward, Em," he said. He shook his head, finally coming to terms with his terrible actions. He exhaled a long sigh. "You're right, though. He fainted on me. I couldn't kill a man who couldn't defend himself, no matter what he'd done. I stuck my scribe in his desk instead of his head. I left him in his office, but as I began to leave the building, I discovered the fire. I went back for him. I managed to get him halfway down the stairs, but he was a dead weight, and I were fair knackered. A fireman turned up. He took him off me and slung him over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes. If he hadn't turned up so quick, we might both be dead. Anyway, I left him with the fireman and explained how the blaze had been started deliberately, and they needed to get the blue bottles. Then I went to the Honeycomb." He wiped his brow and took a breath. "Jed Smith was there, waiting for West. After a bit of a struggle, I collared him. I bust his nose and covered myself in his blood. Then I handed him over to constables. He immediately started squealing and said West had put him up to it. The business was in trouble and West was after the insurance money. West's going to prison, and when he gets out, nobody'll trust him. He's finished as a businessman. He's finished as a man. He faces poverty and suffering. Justice has been done in its own unexpected way, and my mother's truly been avenged." Emma smiled, taking him in her arms, overjoyed. Her unshakable faith in him had proved justified. "That's some story, Daniel Ackroyd. Now you just sit quiet and stay put whilst I pour the tea. You've had more than enough excitement for one day." "William Mather won't be pleased," Daniel pointed out. "West might have been planning to re-equip the mill with the insurance proceeds. I've lost him the order for 2 machines, maybe many more. I've some hard explaining to do tomorrow." "You silly little bugger, Daniel Ackroyd. As if old Mr. Mather would worry about that." Emma hugged him tight and kissed his forehead. "At least you're safe and sound, my love. That's all that counts in the end, when everything's done and dusted." She turned to Constance. The lass seemed to be in a state of shock, still trying to come to terms with the twists and turns of Daniel's story. "Come on, Connie, love, cheer up," she said. "'Tain't the end of the world, I knows. It's just beginning." She looked around at the assembled company. Mary Upton, Rosa and Bella, Susan, old Tom, Esther and Anna, as well as Daniel's father having joined them, all wondering what the fuss and excitement was about. "You and Daniel, me and my Charlie, Amy and Giuseppe, Anna Sutcliffe and young Susan, Mary Upton, Rosa, Bella and Esther Radcliffe, Tom Jenkinson, your mum and Michael, your grandfather and thousands more folk are going to change this world for better. We need to be free, and we will be free. No one can stop us getting democracy if we stick together and fight for what's right and true. If they can get the vote down in Australia, how can they prevent it here? And once us are getting vote, we can begin to make some real changes and build a decent society for all." At that point, Michael O'Donnell walked into the kitchen, his fiddle in hand, and James Leach on his tail. "Something exciting going on?" he asked. Irene Rose laughed and shook her head. "Nothing particularly new, Michael, my love, excepting Emma Chadwick's just made the speech of her young life and mapped out all our futures." She turned to the cotton spinner. "By the way, young Emma, who exactly is your Charlie?" Everyone looked at the young woman in anticipation. The idea she had somebody special in her life being news to all, with the sole exception of young Daniel Ackroyd. Emma had introduced Daniel to Charlie many months before, Shortly after she'd first informed the lad she believed she'd finally found the young man she thought was destined to be her true love and helpmate. The mill worker smiled a quiet smile at all her friend's evident curiosity. "My Charlie? He's quite another story, Miss Rose." Young Daniel chuckled as he took a tearful but exceedingly happy Constance in his arms. He had an advantage over the rest. He knew the story, or at least the beginning of it. Now, with West taken care of, he could look forward to a life without unnecessary distractions. In the not-too-distant future, he would become a family man and a revolutionary, determined to leave the world a better place than the one he'd been born into, just as his mother had attempted to do before him, and hopefully his children would strive to do in their turn. Postscript. My initial inspiration for writing the trilogy of Chartism was a small pamphlet entitled A Celebration of Kersal Moor by Alice Searle, published by herself with the assistance of the Unity Publishing Project in Manchester in May 2009. My writing is of course a work of fiction, although I've tried to keep to the historical background against and within which the stories are set as accurately as possible. In attempting to do so, I have drawn on various sources, including A New View of Society, 1813, and Observations on the Effects of the Manufacturing System, 1817, by Robert Owen, The Moral and Physical Condition of the Working Classes of Manchester, in 1832, by Dr. James Philip Kay, later to become Sir James Kay Shuttleworth, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, 1844, by Frederick Engels, The General Strike of 1842, published by Lawrence and Wishart, 1980, by Mick Jenkins, a pioneer and amateur working class historian and Communist Party organiser I had the honour to work alongside in the 1970s, Chartism and the Churches, by Harold Underwood Faulkner, PhD, Columbia University Press and Longmans Green and Company of London, 1916, Hansard, and other works too numerous to mention. Fictional works sparking my thoughts relating to this period include Manchester Man by Mrs. George Linnaeus Banks, Mary Barton and North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, Felix Holt by George Eliot, and Sybil by Benjamin Disraeli. Despite the demise of the Chartist movement by the 1860s, the first 5 demands of the People's Charter were gradually conceded, culminating in the winning of adult male suffrage in the United Kingdom with the Representation of the People Act 1918, carried at a time when the establishment again feared revolution, the end of the First World War, and the year following the Russian Revolution of 1917. The one point of the Charter not conceded was of course annual parliaments, designed to make MPs more accountable and to help prevent corruption. In view of recent revelations, a great pity perhaps. The aims of the Chartist movement were, of course, won in Australia much sooner, as David Morrison had so prophetically argued. Following the winning of universal suffrage in the state of Victoria as a result of the gold diggers' strike, the first 5 demands of the Charter became law throughout Australia in 1867. In other words, 51 years before they were carried in the UK. I explored Daisy Nook as a kid most Sundays when I lived in Droylsden with my dad between the age of 4 and 8. I should have attended Sunday school, and for a long time my father thought I did. However, Daisy Nook, Ashton Moss, and the countryside generally are greater attractions for me than Hellfire Methodism or tales of gentle Jesus. Unfortunately, in recent years, some bright spark decided to put a motorway through it in the name of progress. Greg's Quarrybank Mill in Style used to be a favourite stop on tandem rides with my son Tom. Now owned by the National Trust, it is still a working cotton mill and well worth a visit, but be prepared to ask searching questions, as Irene Rose did at Bessie's request. The last pauper child indentured there started work in 1841 until 1847, when they finally outlawed the practice in the textile industry, although another 20 years passed before the Factory Acts applied to all places of work. Wherever possible, I have used quotes from known figures such as John Doherty, Richard Osler, James Leach, Richard Pilling, Sir Robert Peel, etc., which they are recorded as having stated. I am pleased to take this opportunity to thank a genuine mill owner's granddaughter, Lady Elaine Johnson of Whernside Manor, Dentdale, for encouraging me to carry on writing, for having the patience to read my efforts, and for her good advice and support. I also take this opportunity to thank Bob Pontefract for checking the accuracy of the historical background I have set these stories in, and for his forbearance, positive criticism, and helpful advice. Thanks are also due to my friend Mick Murray and to Nick Broadhead, both of whom did an invaluable job proofreading my work. Comments or criticism will be most welcome. All my books and my contact details can be found on my website www.meltsbooks.com. This audiobook has been published by the Northern Grove Publishing Project, West Didsbury, Manchester, on behalf of the Working Class Movement Library in Salford. A link to the library's website can be found on my own website, which again is www.meltsbooks.com.